Hello everyone, this is our final lecture on our topic of war, trade, and empire. And now we're going to look at the years from 1714 to 63. We're going to get to some of the nitty gritty aspects of some of the war. Now, again, the immediate legacy of the Treaty of Utrecht, the Peace of Utrecht, was a peace that lasted almost 2 decades because France was, in essence, neutralized. France emerged from a century of warfare, like Spain earlier, exhausted financially and militarily. Louis XIV died in 1715 after a reign of 73 years, confessing that he had perhaps been too much in love with war. Now, because he had outlived his son and all but one grandson, who, as Felipe V, King of Spain, could not succeed in France without violating the Treaty of Utrecht and starting another war, he was succeeded by his great-grandson, a child of 5, Louis XV. Now, inevitably, France was ruled by a regency council. The first regent, Philippe, Duc d'Orléans, worked out a deal with the Parlement of Paris. He restored a right to veto royal acts that Louis XIV had taken away. He disbanded the court at Versailles and moved the capital back to Paris and established a set of 8 councils. The Polisnidi, staffed by the ancient aristocracy, or the nobility of the sword, to run the kingdom. Now, in 1719, Orléans attempted to bring the financial revolution to France by embracing the scheme of a Scottish speculator named John Law to establish the Mississippi Company for investment in the French territory of Louisiana, and the Banque Royale to issue notes and stock, which created a rash of speculation that became known as the Mississippi Bubble. Now, Orléans died in 1723 and was succeeded by the Duc de Bourbon. Now, in 1726, the legacy passed to wise old Pacific Cardinal André Hercule de Fleury, who believed in the necessity of peace to give young Louis time to grow up and keep France's rickety crown finances solvent, and served from 1726 to 1743. And he encouraged trade and stabilized the economy. Now, meanwhile, in Britain, Britain's Queen Anne died in 1714. The crown passed immediately to the next Protestant heirs to the throne, as determined by Parliament, the House of Hanover. Now, George, Elector of Hanover, became King George, later George I, of Great Britain and Ireland. He was rather elderly by contemporary standards, 54 years old, and he was content to be a constitutional monarch, leaving government in the hands of his chief minister, Sir Robert Walpole. George II continued the same policies. Now, Sir Robert Walpole served as head of the British Treasury and, in effect, Prime Minister from 1720 to 1742, by running a vast patronage empire and by keeping taxes low. To do that, Walpole had to keep Great Britain at peace. Thus, a period of relative calm and stability in France and England yielded 2 decades of peace. However, as Walpole and Fleury entered their second decade of power, the European situation was heating up once again. The preliminaries, this time, came from Eastern and Southern Europe. During the time from 1733 to 1735, and not fully resolved until 1738, France and Spain joined against Russia and Austria in a cynical squabble over the throne of Poland, known as the War of the Polish Succession. Now, some of these names are going to be hard to pronounce here, and I apologize. The Treaty of Vienna in 1735 settled matters by shuffling crowns around like poker chips. Augustus III kept Poland for Russia. Stanislaus Szczesny, the claimant backed by France, became Duke of Lorraine. The existing Duke of Lorraine, Francis Stephen, became the Grand Duke of Tuscany, and Spain got Naples and Sicily. What a mess. Now, in 1739 to 1742, the British fought against Spain in a trade war that became known as the War of Jenkins' Ear. Now, the Austrian succession precipitated a much larger crisis. In 1740, the royal family of Austria faced a succession crisis when Emperor Charles VI died and was succeeded by his daughter Maria Theresa. Prussia, sensing an opportunity, invaded the rich farmland of Silesia. Now, the rulers of Prussia had built a small but powerful and efficient state, backed by a great army. Frederick II plunged Europe into the War of the Austrian Succession by invading the Austrian territory of Silesia. Now, Maria Theresa rallied her people, addressing the Hungarian Diet while holding up her children for them to see. France joined Prussia against its traditional enemy, the Habsburgs. Now, Walpole had been reluctant to involve Britain, but the war was very popular. And once he fell from power after the War of Jenkins' Ear did not go well, Britain decided to ally with Austria in 1742. Now, this War of Austrian Succession that lasted from 1740 to 48 was really two nearly separate wars. Austria versus Prussia on the continent over the Austrian Succession and Silesian farmland, and Britain versus France at sea in North America and in India over colonies and trade. Now, at first, things went well for Prussia and France. Frederick rolled over the Austrian army. The French under Maurice, Comte de Saxe, invaded the Austrian Netherlands, defeating the defenders at Fontenoy and Rocourt. France launched an invasion of Scotland to try to place the Stuart pretender, the titular James III and VIII, on the throne. Now, the pretender's son, Bonnie Prince Charles, or Charles Edward Stuart, defeated an English army and took Edinburgh. Charlie, though, found no support in England, and his troops, the Jacobites, were routed at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. He fled, in disguise, to France soon after. Still, for a while, the only thing keeping Austria afloat was English money. But the war turned toward the British and Austrians after 1746. Maria Theresa launched a reform of the Austrian government and army. The British Navy and Army won crucial victories at sea and in North America, but the French and Prussian armies held their own on the continent, as did the French in India. The Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle was both a draw and a timeout. Both sides went back to their previous borders, and they began to gear up for round two. Now, diplomats on both sides worked overtime after the war, leading to a diplomatic revolution. Desperate to recover Silesia, Count Kaunitz, the Austrian foreign minister, abandoned the traditional rivalry with the Bourbons and engineered a switch to France. Now, this seemed logical because both Austria and France were Catholic and absolutist monarchies. And above all, the Austrians were still impressed with the military power of France, the legacy of Louis XIV. Now, Kaunitz's move was, in fact, a blunder. Prussia joined with Britain. Both states had Protestant monarchies. Prussia and Britain were also the two best-run large states in Europe, and the alliance married Europe's best army with Europe's greatest navy and biggest bank account. Now, following the War of Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War is actually misnamed because it actually began in the previous year in North America. In 1755, the British sent an army of regulars and colonial militia under Edward Braddock to attack Fort Duquesne on the site of modern Pittsburgh. The strategic significance of this site is that it was at the juncture of three rivers, the Ohio, the Allegheny, and the Monongahela, control of which would lead to control of much of North America. Now, the assault failed, and Braddock was killed, leaving a young George Washington in command, but the great game was now on. Now, the early years of this war, the 7 Years' War, were disastrous for the British and the Prussians. Although Frederick won some battles, the siege of Prague failed in 1757, and by 1760, Berlin had fallen. At sea, a British raid on Rochefort failed, and the French destroyed the British Mediterranean fleet until Admiral Byng, who was court-martialed and shot for the defeat, had captured Minorca. In America, the French captured Fort Oswego and Fort William Henry, while a British expedition sent to capture Cape Breton, north of Nova Scotia, was destroyed by a storm. In India, the French took Calcutta. The result was political turmoil and reform. George II named a new prime minister, William Pitt, who, like Winston Churchill 2 centuries later, proved a great war minister. Basically, Pitt threw money and 18th century reason at the problem. He first raised taxes and borrowed hugely against government credit. And he spent that money on an army that grew to 100,000 men, a navy that grew to 70,000 men, shipyards and foundries, and subsidies to keep the Prussian army in the field in Europe. The latter was crucial because Pitt concentrated British forces in North America and India. The French and Austrians simply could not keep up. The year 1759 came to be known in Britain as the Annus Mirabilis, or Miracle Year. In Europe, a British and German army defeated the French decisively at Menden. At sea, a French invasion attempt was thwarted when the French fleet was defeated in the Mediterranean. And in America, the British finally captured Fort Duquesne, renaming it Pittsburgh, Guadeloupe in the Caribbean, and Quebec after a British army under George James Wolfe stormed the Plains of Abraham. In India, General Clive threw the French out of Bengal. Now the war dragged on for a few more years into the reign of Britain's King George III. Now, unlike the subtle masterpiece of diplomacy at Utrecht in 1713 and 14, the Treaty of Paris in 1763 was a brutal recognition of force. Britain, the clear winner, got Canada, all of the American territories to the Mississippi, Grenada, Dominica, Tobago, and St. Vincent in the West Indies, Senegal in Africa, and the removal of the French East India Company troops from India. Prussia kept Silesia. France retained a few islands off Canada, the West Indies, and Africa, and a few trading ports in India, but French colonial ambitions were crushed. The promise of Utrecht at Paris, the longest purse, had won an empire. The race begun by Prince Henry the Navigator seemed to have been won by King George III.